Everybody. I'm Jonathan Williams. I am the lead pastor of Forefront Church in New York City. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I am with...
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah New. I'm the executive director of Forefront Church. All pronouns are okay with me.
Yeah. And we're here for Theology Thursdays. Exciting times. And we are going to talk about politics today. We're going to talk about the politics of Jesus. So let's do that. And I want to start. We got a Yelp review recently, maybe a couple weeks ago. I don't remember. Basically, like saying, like, hey, you all should know that this church is really, really political, and you should know that this church doesn't talk about Jesus enough. Something to that effect. I forget exactly how it went, and I haven't responded yet. But like, I totally want to respond by saying, like, yes, our church is a political church. What do we mean by that, sir? What do we mean when we say our church is a political church?
I think we think about it. I always try to clarify with people that when we say we're political, we don't mean that we're partisan. So partisan is like vote Democrat or vote Republican and vote for this candidate or don't vote for this candidate. When we say political, we mean we are taking a stance on issues of equity and power. So whether it has to do with race, whether it has to do with gender or certain identity or housing or incarceration, these are issues of power that impact people unequally. And as a church, we're not going to be neutral on that. Now, how that translates into who you vote for or what party should you register at, that's kind of your own decision. But at least for our church, this is where we take our stance. But Jonathan, do you want to explain a little bit more of why we feel like that's a Jesus thing to do, I suppose?
No, listen, it's absolutely a Jesus thing to do. So a lot of people will say, well, like, Jesus wasn't political. I mean, that's the farthest thing from the truth. I think so much of what Jesus did was political, starting from birth. From birth, we have a king, who acts a bit as a governor who is ready to kill children, right? And so one of the first things Jesus' family has to do is they have to flee and they have to go to Egypt, right? So that's a super political, not only that, but social issue that they faced in those times, right? So Jesus' life starts in political tension. I think about like Jesus' traveling partners. So Joanna, wife of Chuza, was one of Jesus' traveling partners. Who was Joanna, wife of Chuza? Well, Chuza was Herod's right-hand man. He was the Pence to Trump, so to speak, right? And here we have his wife traveling with Jesus. That's a super political statement, like having that person's wife travel with you. We have to remember that in context and culture of Scripture, anytime Jesus is talking about the religious elite, he's talking about people who can wield political power, right? And so what does he do to those religious elite? Almost every single time, he's like, woe to you, religious elite. Those of you who think you have it right. You do not have it right. You have it wrong. You are for the wrong things. You are not for equity. You are for power, right? So he's speaking to politics often. And then, like, the biggest thing is he directly calls out Herod in our Bible. Again, Herod being, the governor of the time, the one who governed that area. And he calls Herod a fox, which means Jesus, if Jesus had Twitter, he'd be on Twitter right now calling Trump names. Like, calling Herod a fox means he's like calling somebody weak-willed or of weak character, of no backbone, right? Jesus says that in our scriptures. Jesus was absolutely political. Palm Sunday, political. People are rallying around who they think is going to be their new king, the political king that's going to overthrow the government. And then the big one is Jesus was crucified at the hands of the state. It wasn't some random people. It was a governor. It was people in charge that crucified. The life of Jesus is a political life, and Jesus operates in that political life over and over, like you say, over and over to bring equity. So anytime Jesus doesn't see equity happening or doesn't see people given power that they deserve, Jesus is going to speak up in political ways to make sure that power is seen, it's given, and equity is created. So yeah, it's all over our scriptures. Jesus is absolutely political.
It's almost like what you're saying is that Jesus was a human being who existed in space and time. And so naturally, Jesus interacted with political systems. It's like he wasn't on an island just like doing theology by himself. Like he was interacting with government officials, who's interacting with like people who are disenfranchised, people who are in power, just like, we all do. And of course he interacts with them, and that is like the way he does so leaves a particular message. And at least for me, I always think about that when people ask like why political. It's if we care about the lives of people in our church or care about people in general in the way that we think, everyone should, but as Christians, we definitely should. I believe everyone's created in the image of God. Then we should care about all the forces that impact their lives. We should care about what causes people anxiety when they see a police officer, what causes people anxiety during COVID, about not being able to afford healthcare because they have bad health insurance. Like that is not something as someone who does some pastoral care. I'm like, okay, oh well, we're not going to talk about your anxiety about health insurance because that's not a spiritual problem. That's not under my domain of the church. Let's just talk about your walk with God. No, we are going to talk about that. And we'll pray about that, and we'll try to help you around that. So at least that's at least how I approach it, on just like a basic level.
No, and I think that level is incredibly important, especially on a week like this week. I mean, in a week where we're seeing, blatantly power not only being taken away from people, but lives being taken away from people based on systems of injustice, right? And so for that, yeah, absolutely. What you said matters. Like maybe we're not affected by it. Maybe, well, I'll speak for me. Maybe I'm not affected by it, but I am not doing my job as a Christ follower if I'm saying, well, I'm good. I'm just going to talk about my spiritual walk instead of making sure that everyone is brought into the same kind of power that I have. And that's a Jesus thing, 110% completely.
Totally. Jim just asked a great comments, which is how do we reconcile Jesus being political and speaking power to government, but then also saying give to Caesar what is Caesar's? Essentially, all the verses that's about submitting to authorities. I think Paul also talks about that in Romans 13, I think.
He does.
Thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I always feel like this is a little bit easy. Like the Paul one is super easy to address. Paul says, hey, respect government authorities while being civilly disobedient the entire time. So when we go to other places, Paul's expressing civil disobedience over and over. And what Paul's basically saying is, yeah, there are people governing us, but it doesn't mean that we don't look for that equity or look to create that equity. With Jesus, this is how it was told to me one time. And I think this is probably the easiest, maybe a little too simplistic, but I'll say it anyway. You have people that go off the grid in America. Think about the militias in Idaho that say, I'm going to stop paying my taxes. I'm going off the grid. I'm full on revolting against America. I've armed myself to the teeth. That's who Jesus is talking to. Jesus is saying, hey, don't do that. That's actually counterproductive to the mission that we're trying to accomplish in creating equity for others. Instead, pay your taxes. That way you don't get yourself in a place where you can no longer act in accordance with the will of God, right? Like that's where Jesus is going with that. For some reason, we make that to be everything that the government says goes. Support the government 100%. No, it means like don't put yourself in a position where your work is compromised by doing something as ridiculous as going off the grid, not paying taxes, whatever that may be. Again, when we put it in context and culture, if you have a group of militia people saying to Jesus, should we get our guns and move to Idaho and create bunkers and do that? Jesus would go, no, pay your taxes. And yet for some reason we think that, we use that to cover everything. So
that's helpful. I think, by the way, I don't know if you're on the chat, but Christina also had a question around when Jesus refers to himself as Son of Man versus Son of God, does one label bear any political weight or not? I don't know if you have quick thoughts there.
Oh, wow. That's a fantastic question, Christina.
I think Daniel Kirk has a book on Jesus as the Son of Man and the political. I think he talks more about theological implications per se. But what were you gonna say?
No, keep going.
Well, it kind of gets to what you're talking about, Christina. But it's all about looking at Jesus as, when Jesus refers to as Son of Man, seeing Jesus not necessarily just as fully God, fully divine, but also as the full human representation of who God is calling all human beings to embody and be. So all the supernatural powers we see Jesus do, Kirk talks about all the ways in which we actually see his disciples do a lot of those things, like resurrect people from the dead. Technically, Paul does that in the book of Acts. And so we see Jesus as more as a foreshadowing, precursor of human potential, almost, not just a reflection of God. So at least that's his basic thesis. I have not read the book though. I just follow him a lot on Twitter.
I mean, I think that's the best. I actually feel like, Christina, this is something I need to like study a little bit more. I'm not sure, to be honest, how whether or not it holds any political weight. But now I'm super curious to find out. Yeah. So when we say,
I mean, one of the most political things Jesus does is what's the Caesar thing where he flips the how people refer to Caesar and has people refer to him.
Okay, so in those times, in those times, everybody would say Caesar is Lord. And in fact, when you went into the temple, there was a statue of an eagle, which represented Caesar. And you would have to touch that statue and you would have to say Caesar is Lord. And then what Jesus starts to do is he starts to say, well, I'm Lord. And Jesus is Lord. And people start to say Jesus is Lord, which is a super political thing to do when you have a Caesar. And you're basically saying, Caesar, you no longer are in power in my heart, so to speak. It's Jesus who is going to speak to the way in which I'm going to live. Yeah. So, that's a political thing for certain, the idea that Jesus. In fact, I read somewhere, I forget where, that people who were caught with like letters that said Jesus is Lord were arrested on the spot. Like it was that controversial, that big of a deal. I'll have to find that book as well. Yeah.
So it's kind of like pay taxes to him, but wink, wink, like he's not really in charge. Is that kind of the deal?
I mean, I guess when I think of Jesus, like, I think of anybody who's civilly disobedient, right? People who are civilly disobedient don't stop paying taxes. They don't go off the grid, but they continually call out the injustices and indiscretions of the government, right? Like,
right. It's engaging as opposed to disattaching and finding your private island in the Bahamas or somewhere to retreat to.
Well, yes and no. I mean, we have the Sons of Thunder who are disciples.
Oh, that's true. They're trying to overthrow.
And they're trying to overthrow the government, right?
That's true.
They're the ones that do want to take up arms and they do want to fight. And Jesus is like, no, like relax a little bit. Like let's be a little civilly disobedient. Let's do that instead.
He's definitely more pacifist than.
Yeah.
I would say that is a stance probably you could say safely. I don't know if you have any concluding thoughts. My short concluding thought, just to wrap up everything, is that I think we just have to acknowledge there's some subjectivity in how we approach this. I don't think we're claiming that any idiot who reads the Bible can clearly see that, mass incarceration is a racialized system that doesn't, what have you, or that, obviously universal healthcare is the obvious conclusion from reading the book of Luke. I think to fall into that trap would be to fall into rhetorical moves that conservative, churches do, where they say it's so obvious that the Bible says you should be pro-life or you should be anti, gay marriage. But I think what we will say is, although there are many different interpretations of Jesus in the Gospels, there's an interpretation that we choose to ascribe to and hold to, and we think there's good backing and support for it. But I don't think we'd be so, arrogant to claim that it is universally lucid to any sentient being. I don't know. What do you think, Jonathan?
I think the beauty of our scriptures is that they're constantly subjective and they're constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted and imagined and reimagined. And this is part of that. And I think that's the beauty of our scriptures. The beauty is that we get to do that. And so we say as a church at Forefront that we are ushering in the next 500 years. And we believe that the politics of Jesus, following the politics of Jesus, are part of that ushering in. And so that's a place where we choose to follow Jesus and be loud about it,
Yep. We should talk about our justice team maybe a little bit.
Yeah, if you're interested in more, we have a justice group, and we'd love for you to be a part of that group. If you want to be a part of that group, you can just leave a comment, and I will private message you a link to getting involved.
We have an intake form, actually. We just set up.
Oh, you did? Nice. Yeah. Well, you just set it up while we were talking?
No, like yesterday.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Well, of course you did. Nice job, as always. But anyway, we're so thankful that you joined us for another Theology Thursday. We're thankful that you joined us in ushering in the next 500 years. And to the person who did leave that Yelp review, you are right. We are political, and we're political because Jesus is at the center of everything that we do. And it doesn't mean we're not praying. It doesn't mean we're not caring for one another. It doesn't mean we don't care about personal relationships with Jesus. It does mean that we care about equity for all. And Tim Nelson, brother, thank you. Appreciate it. I do have a nice hat on.
Next Thursday, what are we talking about? Oh, are we done?
Oh, you want to talk about career inclusion next Thursday?
Oh, yeah, we can do that.
All right, let's talk about career inclusion next Thursday.
All right. See y'all
Bye, everybody.
at 1:30.
Thank you. Appreciate it.